Very unhappy. Republicans shoved through their nominee. Then, when I'm discussing that, I have internet difficulties, so I had to reset everything. So, it's been an annoyance at the very least. But, welcome. Hello. Salutations. I am munching on some toaster pastries. But anyway, let's jump right into it with the news, shall we? Let's see. Just a bunch of news on Kavanaugh. Do, do, do. Big donor to Trump campaign made overture on top Russian official to review the emails in conjunction with the Guardian. They cannot be independently verified, but let me open up here. Big donor to Trump campaign made overture to top Russian official boasting of connections. The businessman who donated 273,000 in 2016 wanted a face-to-face meeting with a Russian official. Simon Cooks. Mm-mm-mm. Look, both sides have issues, but I find the Republicans really frightening as a ruling party. I honestly do. How trauma affects memories. Scientists weigh in on the Kavanaugh hearings. Let's see what else is going on. Facebook says attack exposed info of 50 million users. Christine Blasey Ford's testimony through the eyes of a survivor. U.S. midterm hackers expose staggering voter machine flaws. You know what? Let's just move on to science. Oh yeah, sports news. Last night the Rams beat the Vikings by a touchdown. There you go. Argentina's economic crisis could trigger scientific collapse. Mm-mm. We're already on scientific collapse. NASA climate mission Trump tried to kill moves forward. Why do you hate science and fact? I swear, if I had the money, I'd contribute to pushing for scientific. And we've seen the drop, the effect on society, where there's a lot more people now that believe vaccines cause autism, that the world is flat, that climate change doesn't exist, and it's not. It's only exacerbated by the speed of the digital age and social media, how fast news travels or non-news. It's frightening. It really, really is. Today in history, let's look at that. I'm not even doing the goofy words like science or today in history. Yeah, I'm disheartened by the news of Kavanaugh's push through. It really has broken me. People go, "Why so sad at this?" Because it's a bad sign for this country. It really, really is. On this day in 1941, Ted Williams becomes the last player to hit for 400 in a season. Also on this day, in 1066, William the Conqueror invades England. Part of the invasion from Normandy into modern day. See Britain's southeast coast. So yeah, modern day England, not Scotland, not Ireland, not even Wales, in England. On this date, in 48 BC, Pompey the Great assassinated. Uh, do, do, do. On this date in 1991, the great jazz trumpeter Miles Davis dies. Today in 1863, Union generals are blamed for the Chickamauga defeat. Alexander M. Cook and Thomas Crittenden lose their commands and are ordered to Indianapolis, Indiana to face court of inquiry following the Federal defeat at the Battle of Chickamauga in Georgia. And that is our news and today in history and science and everything else. Like I said, I'm just kind of disheartened with the whole Kavanaugh hearing stuff. So I don't really have the happy push because honestly, it's frightening. It really is. So, I suggest we just try to ignore the news as much as we can, even though it'll profoundly affect the world, not just the US. And proceed with the lesson. The Egyptian civilization. Yeah. Let me finish this toaster pastry first. Because I'm sorry to keep having to interrupt you all. Just so I can take another bite. So let me finish that off first. I've always had more of an addiction to food than anything else. Used to smoke, just set them down one day, never touched them again. No urge, no nothing. Used to drink, just quit drinking. But food is harder. I find the urge. And especially because, unlike the other two things, your body needs food. So it's always been one of the tougher things for me to kind of get over. But anyway, let's read an excerpt we have in the text here on the Great Flood from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which refers back to our last lesson, which was on Mesopotamia. And then we'll proceed with probably this excerpt here and then into the actual information. The Great Flood. The great poem of Mesopotamian literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, includes an account of Utnapishtim, a Mesopotamian forerunner of the biblical Noah. Utnapishtim, I guess, who had built a ship and survived the flood unleashed by the gods to destroy humankind. This selection recounts how the god Ea advised Utnapishtim to build a boat and how he came to land his boat at the end of the flood. In this section, Utnapishtim is telling his story to Gilgamesh. In those days, the world teemed. The people multiplied. The world bellowed like a wild bull, and the great god was aroused by the clamor. Enlil heard the clamor, and he said to the gods in council, "The uproar of mankind is intolerable, and sleep is no longer possible by reason of the babel." So the gods agreed to exterminate mankind. Enlil did this, but Ea, Sumerian Enki, god of the waters, because of his oath, warned me in a dream. Tear down your house and build a boat. Abandon possessions and look for life. Despise worldly goods and save your soul alive. Tear down your house, I say, and build a boat. Then take up your boat, the seed of all living creatures. Utnapishtim did as he was told, and then the destruction came. For 6 days and 6 nights the winds blew. Torrent and tempest, the flood overwhelmed the world. Tempest and flood raged together like warring hosts. Then the 7th day dawned, and the storm from the south subsided, and the sea grew calm. The flood was stifled. I looked at the face of the world, and there was silence. All mankind was turned to clay. The surface of the sea stretched as flat as a rooftop. I opened a hatch, and the light fell on my face. Then I bowed low. I sat down and I wept. The tears streamed down my face, for on every side was the waste of water. I looked for land in vain, but 14 leagues distant there appeared a mountain, and there the boat grounded. On the mountain of Nisir, the boat held fast. She held fast and did not budge. When the 7th day dawned, I loosed a dove and let her go. She flew away, but finding no resting place, she returned. Then I loosed a swallow, and she flew away, but finding no resting place, she returned. I loosed a raven. She saw that the waters had retreated. She ate. She flew around. She cawed, and she did not come back. Then I threw everything open to the 4 winds. I made a sacrifice and poured out a libation on the mountaintop. And it asks, what does the selection from the Epic of Gilgamesh tell you about the relationship between the Mesopotamians and their gods? How might you explain the difference between this account and the biblical flood story in Genesis? It sounds very familiar. But yeah, that's the excerpt from the Epic of Gilgamesh, The Great Flood. Now, here's a little excerpt The significance of the Nile River and the Pharaoh. Two of the most important sources of life for the ancient Egyptians were the Nile River and the Pharaoh. Egyptians perceived that the Nile River made possible the abundant flood that was a major source of their well-being. This hymn to the Nile, probably from the 19th and 20th dynasties in the New Kingdom, expresses the gratitude Egyptians felt for the Nile. So here's Hymn to the Nile. Hail to you, O Nile, that issues forth from the earth and comes to keep Egypt alive. He that waters the meadows which recreated in order to keep every kid alive. He that makes to drink the desert and the place distant from water, that his dew coming down from heaven. The Lord of fishes, he who makes the marsh birds to go upstream. He who makes barley and brings Immer into being, that he may make the temples festive. And if you don't know, Immer is another word for wheat. If he is sluggish, then nostrils are stopped up, and everybody is poor. When he rises, then the land is in jubilation, then every belly is in joy, every backbone takes on laughter, and every tooth is exposed. The bringer of good, rich in provisions, creator of all good, Lord of majesty, sweet of fragrance. He who makes every beloved tree to grow without lack of them. Now, as for the Egyptian king, or Pharaoh, was viewed as a god and the absolute ruler of Egypt. His significance and the gratitude of the Egyptian people for his existence are evident in the next hymn here from the reign of Sesostris III, which was around 1880 to 1840 BC. So, hymn to the Pharaoh. He has come unto us that he may carry away Upper Egypt. The double diadem has rested on his head. And a quick note, the diadem is the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. So, saying the Egyptian crown rests upon his head is simply what they're saying. He has come unto us, and has united the two lands. He has mingled the reed with the bee, which are symbols of Upper and Lower Egypt. He has come unto us and has brought the black land under his way. He has apportioned to himself the red land. He has come unto us and has taken the two lands under his protection. He has given peace to the two river banks. He has come unto us and has made Egypt to live. He has banished its suffering. He has come unto us and has made the people to live. He has caused the throat of the subjects to breathe. He has came unto us and has done battle for his boundaries. He has delivered them that were robbed. And that is hymn to the Pharaoh. And in this, it questions, how do these hymns underscore the importance to Egyptian civilization of the Nile and the institution of the Pharaoh? So, how important were, the Nile and the Pharaoh to Egyptian civilization? To reword what they ask. So, but anyway, take a drink. Before we continue, see how long it is here. Old and Middle Kingdoms, the New Kingdom. Okay, it's a few pages worth. I don't know if I'll get through all of it today, but we'll see what we can do. The Egyptian civilization, the gift of the Nile. Although contemporaneous with Mesopotamia, civilization in Egypt revolved along somewhat different lines. Of central importance to the development of Egyptian civilization was the Nile River, that the Egyptian people recognized its significance is apparent in this hymn to the Nile, which we read. The bringer of food, rich in provisions, creator of all good, Lord of majesty, sweet of fragrance, he who fills the magazines, makes the granaries wide, and gives things to the poor, he who makes every beloved tree to grow. Mesopotamia was a river, like Mesopotamia, was a river valley civilization. So where Mesopotamia focused on the Indus, not the Indus, it's India. Now my memory's gone. The two rivers, that's what Mesopotamia focused on. For some reason, I cannot remember them. Like I said, it's part of my memory issues. But yeah, they flow through the Fertile Crescent, because you have the rivers, and on the other side you have the Mediterranean, I guess, where Israel is. Yeah, it'd be. I believe it's Mediterranean. But anyway, that region there is known as the Fertile Crescent because that's where water affects most life. It's in that little boomerang shape. The impact of geography. But yeah, Egypt was affected by the Great Nile, which flowed upstream. One of the very few rivers to do so. Which is weird. You think the Mississippi, it flows down from the north. The Nile River actually flows upward. So it flows from the Mississippi flows from north to south. The Nile flows from south to north. So the Nile is a unique river, beginning in the heart of Africa and coursing northward for thousands of miles. It is the longest river in the world. Thanks to the Nile, an area several miles wide on both banks of the river was capable of producing abundant harvests. The miracle of the Nile was its annual flooding. The river rose in the summer from rains in Central Africa, crested in Egypt in September and October, and left a deposit of silt that enriched the soil. The Egyptians called this fertile land the Black Land because it was dark from the silt and the lush crops that grew on it. Beyond these narrow strips of fertile fields lay the deserts, the Red Land. Unlike the floods of Mesopotamia's rivers, the flooding of the Nile was gradual and usually predictable, and the river itself was seen as life enhancing, not life threatening, although the system of organized irrigation was still necessary. The small villages along the Nile could make the effort without the massive state intervention that was required in Mesopotamia. Egyptian civilization consequently tended to remain more rural, with many small population centers congregated along the narrow band on both sides of the Nile. About 100 miles before it empties into the Mediterranean, the river splits up into two major branches, forming the delta, a triangular shaped territory called Lower Egypt to distinguish it from Upper Egypt, the land upstream to the south. Um, Egypt's important cities developed at the top of the delta. Even today, most of Egypt's people are crowded along the banks of the Nile River. So, while the Mesopotamian rivers, I still can't remember them for the life of me. Tigris and Euphrates. Took me a while. Um, while they were much more difficult to deal with, and you had fears of great floods. In Egypt, the Nile was much more manageable and produced um, a very abundant source of um, silt for growing crops. The surpluses of food that the Egyptian farmers grew in the fertile Nile Valley made Egypt prosperous, but the Nile also served a unifying factor in Egyptian history. In ancient times, the Nile was the fastest way to travel through the land, making both transportation and communication easier. Winds from the north pushed sailboats south, and the current of the Nile carried them north. Often, when they headed downstream, northward, people used long poles or paddles to propel their boats forward. Unlike Mesopotamia, which was subject to constant invasion, Egypt was blessed with natural barriers that fostered isolation, protected it from invasion, and gave it a sense of security. These barriers included the deserts to the west and the east, or the Sahara and the Nubian deserts, um, the cataracts or rapids on the southern part of the Nile. So it made it difficult to go go follow the river, and um, which it made defense relatively easy, and the Mediterranean Sea to the north, which of course you can always see somebody coming by sea. These barriers, however, did not prevent the development of trade. So, as a civilization, trade was hugely important, but these territories that surrounded Egypt also made it formidable to get through to invade the lands. So it was often very protected. We can close that out. Okay. In essence, Egyptian geography and topography played important roles in the early history of the country. The regularity of the Nile floods and the relative isolation of the Egyptians created a sense of security that was accompanied by a feeling of changelessness. Egyptian civilization was characterized by a remarkable degree of continuity over thousands of years. It was no accident that the Egyptians uh, believed in the cyclical rather than the linear progress. Just as the sun passed through its daily cycle and the Nile its annual overflow, Egyptian kings reaffirmed the basic, unchanging principles of justice at the beginning of each new cycle of rule. And that'll lead us into the Old and Middle Kingdoms. Before we do, however, let's take a look at this little section here. It's got a map of ancient Egypt. Egyptian civilization is centered on the life-giving water and flood silts of the Nile River, with most of the population living in Lower Egypt, where the river splits to form the Nile Delta. Most of the pyramids built during the Old Kingdom are clustered at the entrance to the delta. But yeah, um, here you can kind of see the river and its influence. The cities along the river's banks where pyramids are placed, and it shows cataracts or rapids. And let's take a look at the chronology of the Egyptians before we read on here. The early dynastic period, which is dynasties 1 and 2, took place in 3100, circa 3100 to 2686 BC. The Old Kingdom, dynasties 3 through 6, was circa 2686 to 2125 BC. The first intermediate period, or dynasty 7 through 10, took place 2125 to 2055 BC. The Middle Kingdom, dynasties 11 through 12, took place circa 2055 to 1650 BC. The second intermediate period, or dynasties 13 to 17, took place circa 1650 to 1550 BC. And the New Kingdom dynasties, which were dynasties 18 through 20, took place 1550 to 1070 BC. And then post-Empire Egypt took place, which was dynasties 21 through 31, took place 1070 through 30 BC, which puts it kind of along the times that it met up with the Roman Empire. But that little part's up here. Kind of hard to read. Let's see. The Old and Middle Kingdoms, which like I said, dynasties 3 through 6 and 11 and 12. The basic framework for the study of Egyptian history was provided by Manetho, an Egyptian priest and historian who lived in the early 3rd century BC. He divided the Egyptian history into 31 dynasties of kings. Using Manetho's and other lists of kings, modern historians have divided Egyptian history into 3 major periods known as the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. These were periods of long-term availability characterized by strong monarchical authority, competent bureaucracy, freedom from invasion, the construction of temples and pyramids, and considerable intellectual and cultural activity. But between the periods of stability were times of political chaos known as the intermediate periods, characterized by weak political structures and rivalry for leadership, invasions, a decline in building activity, and the restructuring of society. According to the Egyptians' own tradition, their land consisted initially of numerous populated areas ruled by tribal chieftains. Around 3100 BC, the first Egyptian royal dynasty, under a king called Menes, united Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom. Henceforth, the king would be called King of Upper and Lower Egypt, and the royal crown would be a double diadem, signifying the unification of all Egypt. Just as the Nile served to reunite Upper and Lower Egypt physically, kingship served to unite the 2 areas politically. So the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom encompassed the 3rd through the 6th dynasties of Egyptian kings, lasting from 2686 to 2125 BC. It was an age of prosperity and splendor, made visible in the construction of the greatest and largest pyramids in Egypt's history. The capital of the Old Kingdom was located at Memphis, south of the Delta. Kingship was a divine institution in ancient Egypt and formed part of a universal cosmic scheme. What is the king of Upper and Lower Egypt? He is a god by whose dealings one's lives, the father and mother of all men, alone by himself, without an equal. In obeying their kings, subjects help maintain the cosmic order. A breakdown in royal power could only mean that the citizens were offending divinity and weakening the universal structure. Among the various titles of Egyptian kings, pharaoh, usually meaning great house or palace, eventually came to be the most common. Although they possessed absolute power, Egyptian kings were supposed to rule not arbitrarily, but according to set principles. The chief principle was called Ma'at, a cultural precept that conveyed the idea of truth and justice, especially right order and harmony. To ancient Egyptians, this fundamental order and harmony had existed throughout the universe since the beginning of time. Pharaohs were the divine instruments who maintained it and were themselves subject to it. Although theoretically absolute in their power, in practice, Egyptian kings did not rule alone. Initially, members of the king's family performed administrative tasks. But by the fourth dynasty, a bureaucracy was with regular procedures had developed. Especially important was the office of the vizier, steward of the whole land, directly responsible to the king. The vizier was charged with the bureaucracy, with its numerous departments, including police, justice, river transport, and public works. Agriculture and the treasury were the most important departments. Agriculture was, of course, the backbone of Egyptian prosperity, and the treasury collected taxes which were paid in kind. A careful assessment of land and tenants was undertaken to provide the tax base. For administrative purposes, Egypt was divided into provinces, or nomes, as they were later called by the Greeks. 22 in Upper and 20 in Lower Egypt. A governor, called by the Greeks a nomarch, was the head of each nome and was responsible to the king and the vizier. Nomarchs, however, tended to build up large holdings of land and power within their nomes, creating a potential rivalry with the pharaohs. You could also see similarities like this in uh, dynastic Japan with the shogun and the heads of the houses or the heads of the territories. So that was pretty common for local leaders to try to push against the main head, the main big man. the Middle Kingdom. Despite the theory of divine order, the Old Kingdom eventually collapsed, ushering in a period of chaos. Eventually, a new royal dynasty managed to pacify all Egypt and inaugurated the Middle Kingdom, a new period of stability lasting from around 2055 to 1650 BC. Several factors contributed to its vitality. The nome structure was reorganized. The boundaries of each nome were now settled precisely, and the obligations of the nomes to the state were clearly delineated. Nomarchs were confirmed as hereditary office holders, but with the understanding that their duties must be performed faithfully. These included the collection of taxes for the state and the recruitment of labor forces for royal projects, such as stone quarrying. The Middle Kingdom was characterized by a new concern on the part of pharaohs for the people. In the Old Kingdom, the pharaoh had been viewed as an inaccessible god king. Now he was portrayed as the shepherd of his people, with the responsibility to build public works and provide for the public welfare. As one pharaoh expressed it, he, a particular god, created me as one who should do that which he had done, and to carry out that which he commanded should be done. He appointed me the herdsman of this land, or he knew who would keep it in order for him. So again, you see the relationship between the gods and the pharaohs, who are almost seen as almost gods themselves. They're almost like human divinity, almost the way a pope might have been seen at one point. Society and economy in ancient Egypt. Egyptian society had a simple structure in the Old and Middle Kingdoms. Basically, it was organized along hierarchical lines with the god king at the top. The king was surrounded by an upper class of nobles and priests who participated in the elaborate rituals of life that surrounded the pharaohs. This ruling class ran the government and managed its own landed estates, which provided much of its wealth. Below the upper classes were the merchants and the artisans. Merchants engaged in active trade up and down the Nile, as well as in town and village markets. Some merchants also engaged in international trade. They were sent by the king to Crete and Syria, where they obtained wood and other products. Expeditions traveled into Nubia for ivory and down the Red Sea to Punt for incense and spices. Egyptian artisans displayed unusually high standards of craftsmanship and beauty and produced an incredible variety of goods: stone dishes, beautifully painted boxes made of clay, wooden furniture, gold, silver, copper, tools and containers, uh, paper and rope made of papyrus and linen clothing. So, um, modern day Crete and Syria exist. Nubia is south of Egypt, if you kind of want to know where it is. As far as Punt, well, it says down to the Red Sea. So it's in that area there. But I don't know where it is completely as far as modern day maps go. I would have to look at a map to kind of get an idea. The largest number of people in excuse me. The largest number of people in Egypt simply worked the land. In theory, the king owned all the land, but granted portions of it to his subjects. Large sections were in the possession of nobles and the temple complexes. Most of the lower classes and serfs or common people were paid, who were bound to the lord or bound to the land and cultivated the estates. They paid taxes in the form of crops to the king, nobles, and priests, lived in small villages or towns, and provided military service and forced labor for building projects. The culture of Egypt. Excuse me. Something stuck in my throat there. Egypt produced a culture that dazzled and awed its later conquerors. The Egyptians' technical achievements alone, especially visible in the construction of the pyramids, demonstrated a measure of skill unique in the world at the time. To the Egyptians, all of these achievements were part of the cosmic order, suffused with the presence of the divine. Spiritual life in Egyptian society. The Egyptians had no word for religion because it was an inseparable element of existence in the world which they lived. The Egyptians had a remarkable number of gods associated with heavenly bodies and natural forces. Two groups, sun gods and land gods, came to have special prominence, hardly unusual in view of the importance of Egypt's well-being of the sun, the river, and the fertile land along the banks. The sun was a source of life and hence worthy of worship. A sun cult developed, and the sun god took on different forms and names, depending on his specific function. He was worshipped as Atum in human form and as Ra, who had a human body, but the head of a falcon. The pharaoh took on the title son of Ra because he was regarded as the earthly embodiment of Ra. River and land deities include Osiris and Isis and their child Horus, who was related to the Nile and to the sun as well. Osiris became especially important as a symbol of resurrection. A famous Egyptian myth told of the struggle between Osiris, who brought civilization to Egypt, and his evil brother Set, who killed him, cut his body into 14 parts, and tossed them into the Nile. Osiris's faithful wife Isis found the pieces with help of the other gods, restored Osiris to life as a symbol of the resurrection and as judge of the dead. Osiris took an important role for the Egyptians. By identifying with Osiris, one could hope to gain new life, just as Osiris had done. The dead, embalmed and mummified, were placed in tombs, in the case of kings in pyramidal tombs, given the name of Osiris, and by a process of magical identification became Osiris. Like Osiris, they would be brought to Egypt. Like Osiris, they would then be reborn. The flood of the Nile and the new life it brought to Egypt were symbolized by Isis gathering all of Osiris's parts together and were celebrated each spring in the festival of the new land. Later Egyptian spiritual practice began to emphasize morality by stressing Osiris's role as judge of the dead. The dead were asked to give an account of their earthly deeds to show whether they deserved a reward. Other means were also employed to gain immortality. Magical incantations preserved in the Book of the Dead were used to ensure a favorable journey in a happy afterlife. Specific instructions explained what to do when confronted by the judge of the dead. These instructions had two aspects. The negative confession gave a detailed list of what one had not done. I have not committed evil against men. I have not mistreated cattle. I have not blasphemed a god. I have not done violence to a poor man. I have not made anyone sick. I have not killed. I have not caused anyone suffering. I have not had sexual relations with a boy. I have not defiled myself. Later, the supplicant made a speech listing his good actions. I have done that which men said, and that which gods are content. I have given bread to the hungry, water to the thirsty, clothing to the naked, and a ferry boat to him who was marooned. I have provided divine offerings for the gods and mortuary offerings for the dead. So you can kind of see similarities in those stylizings with modern Christianity. They wanted immortality in an afterlife in ancient Egypt. You want to go to heaven and have an afterlife in Christianity. You have to not commit evils in your life on earth, and you're weighed from your good deeds versus your evil. The pyramids. One of the greatest achievements of ancient civilization, The building of pyramids occurred in the time of the Old Kingdom. Pyramids were not built in isolation, but as a part of a larger complex dedicated to the dead. In effect, a city of the dead. The area included a large pyramid for the king's burial, smaller pyramids for his family, and mastabas, rectangular structures with flat roofs, as tombs were well prepared for their residents. The rooms were furnished and stocked with numerous supplies, including chairs, boats, chests, weapons, games, dishes, and a variety of foods. The Egyptians believed that human beings had two bodies, a physical one and a spiritual one, which they called the Ka. Um, if the physical body was properly preserved, that is, mummified, the tomb furnished with all the various objects of regular life, the Ka could return and continue its life despite the death of the physical body. To preserve the physical body after death, the Egyptians practiced mummification, a process of slowly drying the dead body to prevent it from rotting. Special workshops run by the priests performed this procedure primarily for the wealthy families who could afford it. According to Herodotus, an ancient Greek historian who visited Egypt around 500 BC or 450 BC, the most refined method is as follows. First of all, they draw out the brain through the nostrils with an iron hook. Then they make an incision in the flank with a sharp Ethiopian stone, through which they extract all the internal organs. The liver, the lungs, stomach, and intestines were placed in 4 special jars that were put in the tomb with the mummy. The priests then covered the corpse with a natural salt that absorbs the body's water. Later, they filled the body with spices and wrapped it with layers of linen soaked in resin. At the end of its process, they took about 70 days. A lifelike mask was placed over the dead and the shoulders of the mummy. This was then sealed in a case and placed in its tomb in the pyramid. The largest and most magnificent of all the pyramids was built under King Khufu, constructed at Giza around 2540 BC. This famous Great Pyramid covers 13 acres, measures 756 feet at each side of its base, and stands 481 feet high. Its 4 sides are almost precisely oriented to the 4 points of the compass. The interior included a grand gallery to the burial chamber, which was built of granite with a lidless sarcophagus for the pharaoh's body. The Great Pyramid still stands as a visible symbol to the power of Egyptian kings and the spiritual conviction that underlay Egyptian society. No later pyramid ever matched the size or splendor. But an Egyptian pyramid was not just the king's tomb. It was also an important symbol for royal power. It could be seen for miles as a visible reminder of the glory and might of the ruler who was a living God on earth. And here they have a picture Osiris as judge of the dead. According to the Book of the Dead, after making a denial of offenses, the negative confession, The deceased experienced the weighing of the heart, shown here as a judgment scene from the Book of the Dead of Hunefer, a royal scribe who died around 1285 BC. Hunefer's heart is placed on one side of the balance scale. On the other side is a feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth. For Hunefer, heart and feather are of equal weight. So the god Anubis ushers him into the presence of Osiris, seated on his throne at the right. A swallowing monster, a hybrid of a crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus, stood ready at the scale to devour the deceased if he failed the test. And there is that image. But art and writing, commissioned by kings or nobles for use in temples and tombs, Egyptian art was largely functional. Wall paintings and statues of gods and kings in temples served a strictly spiritual purpose. They were an integral part of the present performance of ritual, which was thought necessary to preserve the cosmic order and hence the well-being of Egypt. Likewise, the mural scenes and sculptured figures found in the tombs had a specific function. They were supposed to aid in the journey of the deceased into the afterworld. Egyptian art was also formulaic. Artists and sculptors were expected to observe a strict canon of proportions and determined both form and presentation. This canon gave Egyptian art a distinctive appearance, and this canon gave for thousands of years. Especially characteristic was the convention of combining the profile, semi-profile, and frontal views of the human body in relief work and painting in order to represent each part of the body accurately. The result was art that was highly stylized, yet still allowed distinctive features to be displayed. Writing in Egypt emerged during the first two dynasties. The Greeks later labeled Egyptian writing hieroglyphics, meaning priest carvings or sacred writings. Hieroglyphics were symbols that depicted objects and had a sacred value at the same time. Although hieroglyphics were later simplified into two scripts for writing purposes, they never developed into an alphabet. Egyptian hieroglyphics were initially carved in stone, but later the two simplified scripts were written on papyrus, a paper made from papyrus reed that grew along the Nile. Most of the ancient Egyptian literature that has come down to us was written on papyrus rolls and wooden tablets. So we start seeing now. This is how we get most of the information that we know about Egypt is through these papyrus scrolls and through hieroglyphics written on wooden tablets. The Rosetta Stone is also an important source as it was Egyptian, Greek. I can't remember what the third language was, but it was one that was no longer used and was hard to decipher. But because you had Greek, you could decipher the other two because Greek was understood. But anyway, the pyramids at Giza. The three pyramids at Giza across the Nile River from Cairo are the most famous in Egypt. At the rear of the largest of the three pyramids, the Great Pyramid of Khufu. Next to it is the Pyramid of Khafre. In the foreground is the smaller Pyramid of Menkaure. Standing behind with even smaller pyramids for the pharaoh's wives, covering almost 13 acres. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is immense. It is estimated that the Great Pyramid contains 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing about 2.5 tons. There's the image of the pyramids. But chaos and a new order, the new kingdom. The Middle Kingdom was brought to an end by a new period of instability. An incursion into the Delta region by people known as the Hyksos initiated the Second Age of Chaos. The Hyksos, a Semitic-speaking people, infiltrated Egypt in the 7th century BC and came to dominate much of Egypt. However, the presence of the Hyksos were not entirely negative for Egypt. They taught the Egyptians to make bronze for use in new agricultural tools and weapons. The Hyksos also brought new aspects of warfare to Egypt, including the horse-drawn chariot, a heavier sword, and the compound bow. Eventually, a new line of pharaohs, the 18th dynasty, made use of the new weapons to throw off Hyksos domination, reunite Egypt, and establish the new kingdom, which was circa 1550 to 1070 BC. The launch of the Egyptians along a new militaristic and imperialistic path. During the period of the New Kingdom, Egypt became the most powerful state in the Middle East. The Egyptians occupied Palestine and Syria, but permitted local princes to rule under Egyptian control. I lost my place. Egyptian armies also moved westward into Libya and expanded Egypt's border to the south by conquering the African kingdom of Nubia. The 18th dynasty was not without its own troubles, however. Amenhotep IV circa 1364 to 1347 BC, introduced the worship of Aten, god of the sun disk, as the chief god, and pursued his worship with great enthusiasm, changing his own name to Akhenaten. It is well with Aten. The pharaoh closed the temples of other gods, and especially endeavored to lessen the power of Amun Ra and his priesthood at Thebes. Akhenaten strove to reduce the priest's influence in replacing Thebes as the capital of Egypt with Akhetaten, dedicated to Aten, a new city located near Tel El Armana, 200 miles north of Thebes. Akhenaten's attempt at religious change failed. It was too much to ask Egyptians to ignore their traditional ways and beliefs, especially since they saw the destruction of the old gods as subversive of the very cosmic order on which Egypt's survival and continuing prosperity depended. Moreover, the priests at Thebes were unalterably opposed to the changes, which diminished their influence and power. At the same time, Akhenaten's preoccupation with religion caused him to ignore foreign affairs and led to the loss of both Syria and Palestine. Akhenaten's changes were soon undone after his death by those who influenced his successor, the boy pharaoh, Tutankhamun, 1347 to 1338 BC. Tutankhamun returned the government to Thebes and restored the old gods. The Aten experiment failed to take hold, and the 18th dynasty itself came to an end in 1333 BC. The 18th dynasty managed to restore Egyptian power one more time under Ramses II, circa 1279 to 1213 BC. The Egyptians gained control of Palestine but were unable to reestablish the borders of their earlier empire. New invasions in the 13th century by the Sea Peoples, as the Egyptians called them, destroyed Egyptian power in Palestine and drove the Egyptians back within their old frontiers. The days of the Egyptian Empire were ended, and the new kingdom itself expired with the end of the 20th dynasty in 1070 BC. For the next 1,000 years, despite periodical revivals of strength, Egypt was dominated by Libyans, Nubians, Persians, and finally Macedonians after the conquest of Alexander the Great. In the 1st century BC, Egypt became a province in Rome's mighty empire. At the bottom, we show two pictures. The Egyptian diet. The diet of the upper and lower classes in ancient Egypt varied considerably. Meat and fowl, including beef, goat, pork, goose, and pigeons, were on the tables of the rich. Although done for sport as well as food, hunting waterfowl in the stands of papyrus reeds that grew along the river's banks was a favorable pastime of the Egyptian upper classes. Shown on the left is a hunting scene from the 18th dynasty tomb of Nebamun in Thebes. Nebamun, a nobleman, is seen standing in his boat using his throw stick to hunt birds. He holds 3 birds in his right hand while a cat retrieves 2 in its claws and holds the wings of another in its teeth. The basic diet of the poor consisted chiefly of bread, and the baking of bread was an important task in all households. The tomb painting on the right from the 18th century dynasty tomb of Mena shows 2 men carrying grain while slave girls fight over leftovers in the background. So there are those images. So let's proceed. Daily life in ancient Egypt, family and marriage. Ancient Egyptians had a very positive attitude towards daily life on earth and followed the advice of the wisdom literature, which suggested that people marry young and establish a home and family. Monogamy was the general rule, although a husband was allowed to keep additional wives if his first wife was childless. Pharaohs were entitled to harems. The queen, however, was acknowledged as the great wife, with a status higher than that of the other wives. The husband was master of the house, but wives were very much respected and in charge of the household and education of the children. From a book of wise sayings came this advice: if you are a man of standing, you should found your household and love your wife at home as is fitting. Fill her belly, clothe her back. Ointment is the prescription for her body. Make her heart glad as long as you live. She is a profitable field for her Lord. You should not contend with her at law and keep her far from gaining control. Let her heart be soothed through what may accrue to you. It means keeping her long in your house. Women's property and inheritance remained in their hands, even in marriage, although most careers and public officials were closed to women. Some did operate businesses. Peasant women worked long hours in the fields and at numerous domestic tasks, especially weaving cloth. Upper class women could function as priestesses, and few queens even became pharaohs in their own right. Most famous was Hatshepsut in the New Kingdom. She served as regent for her stepson Thutmose III, but assumed the throne for herself and remained in power until her death. Hatshepsut's reign was a prosperous one, as is especially evident in her building activity. She is most famous for the temple dedicated to herself at Deir el-Bahri in the west bank of the Nile at Thebes. As pharaoh, Hatshepsut sent out military expeditions, encouraged mining, fostered agriculture, and sent a trading expedition to Lower Africa. Because pharaohs were almost always male, Hatshepsut's official status or statues show her clothed and bearded like a king. She was referred to as His Majesty. That Hatshepsut was aware of her unusual position is evident from an inscription she had placed at one of her temples. It read, "Now my heart turns to and fro in thinking, what will the people say? They who shall see my monument in after years and shall speak of what I have done." Marriages were arranged by parents. The primary concern were family and property. And clearly the chief purpose of marriage was to produce children, especially sons. From the new kingdom came this piece of wisdom: take to yourself a wife while you are a youth, that she may produce a son for you. Only sons could carry on the family name. Daughters were not slighted, however. Numerous tomb paintings show the close and affectionate relationship parents had with both sons and daughters. Although marriages were arranged, some of the surviving love poems from ancient Egypt indicated an element of romance in some marriages. Marriages could not end, or could and did not end in divorce, which, or sorry, marriages could and did end in divorce, which was allowed, apparently with compensation for the wife. Adultery, however, was strictly prohibited, and punishments were severe, especially for women who could have their noses cut off or be burned at the stake. So it gives you a peek into Egyptian life, especially how women were seen in the public eye. They did not have the full same rights as men, but considering some societies, it was rather progressive. So that's kind of curious. That's an interesting detail we see. Now let's read this last excerpt. We're at the end of the chapter here. I've just got it and the conclusion. So, upper class Egyptians enjoyed compiling collections of wise sayings to provide guidance for leading upright and successful lives. This excerpt is taken from the instruction of the Vizier Ptahhotep and dates from around 2450 BC. The vizier was the pharaoh's chief official. In this selection, Ptahhotep advises his son on how to be a successful official. The instruction of the vizier Ptahhotep. Then he said to his son, "Let not your heart be puffed up because of your knowledge. Be not confident because you are a wise man. Take counsel with the ignorant as well as the wise. The full limits of skill cannot be attained, and there is no skilled man equipped to his full advantage. Good speech is more hidden than the emerald, but it may be found with maidservants at the grindstones. If you are a leader commanding the affairs of the multitude, seek out for yourself every beneficial deed until it may be that your own affairs are without wrong. Justice is great, and its appropriateness is lasting. It has been disturbed since the time of him who made it, whereas he is punishment for him who passes over its laws. It is the right path before him who knows nothing. Wrongdoing has never brought the undertaking into port. It may be that it is fraud that gains riches, but the strength of justice is that it lasts. If you are a man of intimacy, whom one great man sends to another, be thoroughly reliable when he sends you. Carry out the errand for him as he has spoken. Do not be reserved about what is said to you, and beware of any act of forgetfulness. Grasp hold of truth, and do not exceed it. Mere gratification is by no means to be repeated. Struggle against making words worse, thus making one great man hostile to another through vulgar speech. If you are a man of standing and found a household and produce, a son is pleasing to God, if he is correct and inclines towards your ways and listens to your instruction, while his manners in your house are fitting, and if he takes care of your property as it should be. Seek out for him every useful action. He is your son. You should not cut your heart out from him. But a man's seed often creates enmity. If he goes astray and transgresses your plans and does not carry out your instruction, so that his manners in your household are wretched, and he rebels against all that you say, while his mouth runs in the most wretched talk, quite apart from his experience, while he possesses nothing, you should cast him off. He is not your son at all. He was not really born to you. Thus, you enslave him entirely according to his own speech. He is one whom God has condemned in the very womb. So that was advice that the vizier Ptahhotep gave to his own child. And lastly is conclusion. Although early civilizations emerged in different parts of the world, the foundations of Western civilization were laid by the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians. They developed cities and struggled with the problems of organized states. They developed writing to keep records and created literature. They constructed monumental architecture to please their gods, symbolize their power, and preserve their culture for all time. They developed new political, military, social, and religious structures to deal with the basic problems of human existence and organization. These first literate civilizations left detailed records that allow us to view how they grappled with three of the fundamental problems that humans have pondered: the nature of human relationships, the nature of the universe, and the role of divine forces in the cosmos. Although later peoples, um, I lost my place. Although later peoples in Western civilization would provide different answers from those of the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians, it was they who first posed the questions, gave answers, and wrote them down. Human memory begins with these two civilizations. And like I said, if you want to look at the Eastern nations, there's also the Yellow River civilization in China and the Indus Valley River civilization in India. And as they've also discussed at the beginning of this chapter, other early civilizations have been found. But these two, Egypt and Mesopotamia, are the largest in Western civilization that we can think of. By the middle of the second millennium BC, the creative impulse of the Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations was beginning to wane. The invasion of the Sea Peoples around 1200 BC ushered in a whole new pattern of petty states and new kingdoms that would lead to the largest empires in the ancient Near East that the Near East had ever seen. And we see a timeline here from around 3000 BC to 1000 BC. There we go. So y'all can kind of see that. You had the emergence of the Egyptian civilization first. Right behind it is the early dynastic age of Sumerian city-states and the beginning of cuneiform. And right after it is the Indus Valley civilization. After it, we have Egypt's Old Kingdom, then immediately following the Great Pyramid. The dynastic age of the Sumerian city-states ends right around the time Caral, the Supe River Valley of Peru civilization begins. Then you have Egypt's Middle Kingdom, and towards the end of it is the beginning of the Central Asian civilization. Then you have the Code of Hammurabi, the Babylonian Kingdom. During it is Egypt's New Kingdom. The Indus River Valley civilization kind of ends, and the Shang Dynasty begins. Akhenaten's religious upheaval, and then the Hittite Empire, the end of the Shang Dynasty, and the Central Asian and Supe River civilizations just continue off the timeline. because they only have beyond 1000 BC. So. And that lead to next Friday's lesson, chapter 2, the ancient Near East, peoples and empires. So we're done with chapter 1. Let's see, Monday I'll be back on for more reading of art history. But as always, educate thyself, read, think, study, learn. So important. Everyone needs to do so. It's just hugely important. I do love you all. Thank every one of you for, coming by. And I'll see you all Monday. I hope to have some new edited videos out. But I'll see you all later. Bye.